Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Hello and welcome. We are very excited to have you here with us. My name is Amanda Lewis, and I enthusiastically serve as the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at UIC. And we are thrilled to be doing this collaborative event with the Chicago Teachers Union. For those who may not be familiar, IRRPP is dedicated to advancing research, education, and dialogue on racial and ethnic inequality. And through initiatives like our Legacies of Racism series, of which this is one, we draw on cutting-edge research to deepen our understanding of systemic inequalities and highlight pathways towards justice and equity. And our work is rooted in fostering collaboration among scholars and community members to address pressing issues of race and policy. Today, it is a great joy to have the opportunity to feature the work of one of my favorite scholars, actually two of my favorite scholars, but I'll get to that in a second, and people. 25 and a half years ago, I was lucky enough to start my career at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I met David Stovall on my first day, and he has been a dear colleague and friend ever since. Today's event will feature Professor David Stovall as he discusses his latest book, Engineered Conflict, Structural Violence, and the Future of Black Life in Chicago. He's going to tell us all about it. It's an amazing book. It will be for sale in the back there, so afterwards you can, if you haven't already, purchase a copy. David can sign it. We also have in the back copies of a report that IRRPP published recently that also has essays in the report by both Elizabeth Todd-Breland and David Stovall and many other wonderful colleagues and friends. So you can pick up that for free. And then we also, Haymarket's also selling Elizabeth's book, which will be available at the end. So please pick up more to learn more afterwards. So the way we're going to do this today is I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. David is going to come up and talk to us about his book, and then he will be joined in conversation by Professor Elizabeth Todd-Breland. Let me give you a brief introduction to both of them, and then I will get out of the way. Dr. David Stovall is a professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law and Justice at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research explores critical race theory, the connections between housing and education, and the intersections of race, place, and schooling. Dr. Stovall actively collaborates with community organizations and schools, working to abolish the school-to-prison pipeline and to create equity-centered, critically engaged educational spaces. He is a founding member of the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice and a key figure in the People's Education movement. Dr. Elizabeth Todd-Breland is Associate Professor of History and Affiliate Faculty in Black Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's the author of Political Education, Black Politics, and Education Reform in Chicago since the 1960s, and co-author of I Didn't Come Here to Lie, My Life and Education. Her research and teaching focus on U.S. urban history, African American history, the history of education and public policy. And from 2019 to 2024, Todd-Breland served as a member of the Chicago Board of Education. Last few housekeeping notes. There are two videographers present today. There will be photos taken throughout the event, FYI. The recording of today's event will be made available on our website and YouTube channel. Give us a couple weeks to get it uploaded. A special shout out to Haymarket Books for providing support at today's event. And after the program, there will be a Q&A session. For the Q&A portion, we ask that you write your questions on a note card. There's many around. Dina has some here. I think you were handed one coming in. And we will be collecting them, and then I will shuffle them and then hand them to Elizabeth, who will ask them of David I know that seems like a lot of steps, but we've learned that that's how things go smoothly. But thank you for joining us for this really important conversation. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Stovall.
Thank y'all again so much for coming through. I know, the weather's been a little bit wild, but for those who might trip off that, welcome to Chicago. I want to do a couple of things, and one, before starting tonight, I want to recognize Jackie Vaughn. We don't necessarily say her name enough, and we're in a hall that is dedicated to her. And when we're in those spaces, and Jackie Vaughn was the first black president of the Chicago Teachers Union, and what she actually did was give her bone and blood to struggle. And she's one of the few people that's name we don't actually say enough, because in the late 80s, she was someone who was willing to fight. And she fought relentlessly in terms of making sure that folks had not only representation, but that people were able to see what teachers do and then how they are connected to community space. So I want to recognize her. And I also want to recognize the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, because without you all, this book probably would not have happened, right? It's important to say that, because, as you get older, your friends start to disappear for various reasons, right? And I think that in recognition of many of my friends who are no longer with us, it is important to give honor to the folks who are still here, right? So I think it's really important to talk about that in real time. And in the nature of the madness of all things, right? Many of us wake up in the morning and we say to ourselves, what did that really just happen? And it did, and people told you. So now that folks have told you, it's important to say justice to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, justice to our brothers and sisters in the Sudan, justice to our brothers and sisters in the Congo, justice to our brothers and sisters in Haiti, justice to our brothers and sisters in Venezuela, and justice to our brothers and sisters in Iran. Because we are now part of that global understanding, and in that global understanding, we are now challenged to think about what does it mean in our local and the day-to-day, right? So what I have behind you, and we are praying for our tech, because many of my homies just always crack this joke on me. So like me and slides in 25 years have never been part of the equation, right? So now that I got slides, everybody's like, bro, what you on right now? And I'm always like, I have no clue. So it might work or it might not. So we all here, right? So this is a picture. In 2014, I was pumping gas on the corner of 66 in Stony Island. God bless the South Side. And for folks who live over east, God bless 87th Street, right? So as a Chicago audience, it's always important to say that, right? Because I was just in England and they were like, 87th Street, what are you talking about? And I'm always like, you always got to put the crib wherever you are. So this is the corner, 2014, of 66 and Stony. I was pumping gas, I turn around and I see this. I didn't even notice it driving up. I literally turn around and go, oh. And the thing that surprised me was that this was my friend's brother's building. So first thing I said to myself was, man, Deuce's brother sold the building? And in my head, the next thing I said, being a Chicagoan, was, how much did they pay him for it? Because this becomes the question of preparing us for what's coming. Because that building, this destruction, is less than a mile away from the newly minted and about to open on my birthday Obama Presidential Center. So now we have to ask a different question. What is this preparation for? Who is in that preparation analysis? And then what will be done in the process? So it allowed me to kind of think about this in a very particular way that also challenged me to talk about, well, what does this mean internally? Because Chicago has actually experienced a certain type of uneven development over the last 40 years. And we have to talk about that in a very specific way. So let me see if oh, it worked, yo. All right. So this thing around engineering conflict, and I take this from the idea of engineering as a component of manufacturing. And my analysis was sharpened by a scholar by the name of Catherine Cho. I went to UCLA and did a workshop about this. And she did her undergrad as an engineer. And she said, look, one of the key components of engineering is the elimination of human error. So now if I think about a city like Chicago, and I think about what has happened in people's particular neighborhoods, the second question I asked was, well, who has been determined the error? And what has been done to eliminate them? Right? So now we have to think about this, and I use something called critical race spatial analysis. And all that means quickly is every space has a racial story. Every building has a racial story. No matter where we are, place is connected to race. Race is always in conversation with place, right? So many of us, you might go up the street and be on, it's now Fulton Market, right? And if you notice anything about Fulton Market, nobody from Chicago is on Fulton Market, right? But you also have $1 Million Hotels, King Google before they relocate to the old Thompson Center, right? And now you're wondering, if you're there at night, you see all these black cars, right, that are driving folks around, and you're asking this question, well, what's happening here, right? And I'm in a space where my uncles used to work, right? So my uncles used to work in the meatpacking corridor, right? And ironically, when you go to the meatpacking district in New York City, it's the exact same thing. No more meatpackers. So now we got to ask this particular question, right? And this is something that folks at IRRPP, Eve Ewing, and other folks have been alerting us to. The city of Chicago has lost 350,000 black people since 1980. Now, there's an important caveat to that. The vast majority of that 350,000 people have left the city since 2000. So now the question becomes, where have they left from? What has been left in their departure? Right? So now when we think about that in real time, we have to think about who has been determined to be disposable and who is determined to be valuable. And how do we see value and disposability in every aspect of life in Chicago? Right? Because if I'm in certain neighborhoods, I am very clear about who is valued. If I'm in other spaces, I am very clear about who has been rendered disposable. Right? And we look no further than vacant lots, look no further than the concentration of vacant lots, look no further than the concentration of depopulated schools. Right? So now we have to ask a different question, right? And this is, for me as a Chicagoan, I'm always looking to this because in many spaces, as Chicagoans, we know this to be real, but we may not articulate it publicly. We have the conversation with the homies. We have the conversation when that building goes down that we're familiar with, but then it's harder for us to have the conversation when that building gets torn down or when we're in an older neighborhood that we once knew. And now that those buildings have been torn down and been replaced with something else, we may no longer know where we are. I always think about Milwaukee Avenue, right? Bucktown Wicker Park, right? That was a different space 20 years ago. Now, the goal here today is to not start the conversations with, what's wrong with y'all? Back in my day, I knew something else. No, because as soon as I start that conversation, I'm about to lie to you, right? So now the conversation becomes, well, what has been replaced and what has been the rationale of the replacement? And in that process, who has been deemed valuable? And then do we see the signs of their value? And then who has been deemed disposable? And do we see the signs of their disposability? And the question that I'm asking is, can a city make you fight the people that you should be in solidarity with because you refuse to see the thing that oppresses you? Right? And to ask that question unapologetically, and it comes from Togo Eason Martin, who wrote an essay called like Normal Speeding Bullets. Right? So this thing around how are you engineered in one way to see the people that you should be in solidarity with now as the enemy. Right? So if we work for us once. There we go. Yes. So, thanks, Dave. In this issue, what is this thing around the marking of disposability? If you have been in Chicago over the last 15 years, you've seen these red X's, right? This particular red X is one that is on Muddy Waters' house. Right? So until his house, so now it's, people saw that it was marked for demolition. People saw that, put some money together, bought it, and now it's being opened as a museum. But Muddy Waters' house was marked for demolition because taxes hadn't been paid on it in 10 years. So anytime you see a red X in Chicago that looks like this, all this means is that taxes haven't been paid for 10 years and no one has laid a claim to the building. What it also means is that a developer can take it at any given moment if they're willing to pay the taxes. Right? So now you have a process. You have literally marked the disposability. You have literally marked these new spaces because that home is on 43rd and Lake Park Avenue. And you all probably just saw this report. The property taxes in Lake Park, I mean, not on Lake Park, but in Kenwood and Oakland, have actually risen 600%. So now, who is that for, right? And now that question is racialized. The question is also put in the context of class. It's also put in the context of gender, right? So now, again, reviewing who is valued and who is disposable, but also rethinking violence. And I think this is important to say. It is not about us condoning violence. But if we understand it, can we do more to be preventative? And this becomes the question. If you understand violence as the source, if you understand that violence can be engineered, now what can we actually do to change conditions? And there have been some local organizations in the city who have been working to engage that, right? So again, and putting these conversations together, right? Because housing and education are inextricably connected in any location across the planet. And I took this quote from a good friend of mine, Shannon Bennett, who's the executive director of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. And he always says, housing is an education issue because education is a housing issue. They are always connected. And all you have to do to see value and disposability is what schools look like and the housing in that area that's in proximity to those schools, right? It is a very simple process. But the thing is, what does it mean to name it? And then what do we do upon that naming, right? So let's look at school closings. And what I want to do is pay attention to more of the insidious nature of school closings. Many of us were devastated in 2013 when schools closed, when 50 schools were closed. But if you look at before 2013 and then after 2013, you see a process that becomes more insidious. And I want to take you all through one of these processes. And it's connected to a school that some of you all may know in the Albany Park neighborhood by the name of Maria Hogan. Right? Now, Maria Hogan is local elementary school, neighborhood-based school, attendance boundaries. And one of my former students invited me to give a talk at the school. So I drive up and I pull up into the parking lot and my guy is working maintenance. And that's another thing about Chicago. If you're here long enough, you get to know everybody, right? So I literally pull up and my guy is outside. He had to do something. Outside. So we clapped it up and he said, what's happening? He said, man, you giving a talk here at the schoolhouse? And I was like, yeah, man, I'm looking for Maria Hogan. And he said, which one? Because there is the Maria Hogan that is the neighborhood public school, and directly behind it is a Maria Hogan that is a charter. So it's not this thing around being distanced from each other. They are catty-cornered to each other. So now let's think about what that means in terms of schools, in terms of depopulating schools. Albany Park is an actual port of entry for many immigrant families. So now as they start to talk to each other and they say, well, look, which school are you going to send your kids to? And they say, Maria Hogan, which one do they gravitate towards? So now that new school becomes the depopulation engine, right? So now we think about that in real time. And then you get another insidious process. And this one is the switch. And the switch, I keep on thinking about what does it do to young people? And let me give you all an example of the switch. So I live in Woodlawn. Now, Woodlawn has these two schools. One was called Fisk. The other one was called Sexton. They are literally 2 blocks away from each other, right? But in a city that is hyper-segregated. So Cottage Grove became the boundary. So those are the people who lived across Cottage and the people who lived east of Cottage. Notice I didn't say west of Cottage. In Chicago, you live across or on the other side, right? So literally at Sexton, and strange thing, Fisk had the quote unquote higher performing test scores, but Sexton had the building that was in the best repair. So they literally closed Fisk, send all the students to Sexton, and rename that building Fisk. I promise you this is real. You could go right to the Sexton building and see its name shifted to Fisk, right? And I'm just saying to myself, now think about this, y'all. In a hyper-segregated city like Chicago, if I split this room in half, you all are one school, you all the other, I close you and then send everybody to that school that's still open, what happens? Right? And when people say fights, I always ask my students, have you ever been in a fight that you don't even know who you're fighting? Right? It's that type of intensity, right? So now you're in that fight, and I'm going to say this publicly. I refuse to believe that no one in central office had this same understanding, right? And to play that off is like, what we didn't know is some bullshit, right? And we have to say that out loud. Right? Because when you do that 204 times in a city, you know something is happening. Right? So now, when they make that shift, the first day at Fisk, Sexton, what's happening? Them young folks are dumping. At no fault of their own. But now we have to think about what that engineering does. Because segregation creates a false enemy. And now when you think about that enemy and you're in contact with that enemy, the first thing to do is defend yourself. Right? And now think of the young folks who have been displaced twice. So the young people at Sexton, they get their building closed, name changed, but they stay in the same place, get a whole new group of students, and now the first thing is, as Chicagoans do, who are they? Right? So now you have created the mechanism for there to be antagonistic relationships, right? Not as something conspiratorial. And I think this is important, right? I don't want y'all to leave today, Stovall said we all gonna die. No. The thing is to understand this not as conspiracy. This is public policy. They told us, right? And they did not try to hide it, right? So to put this in real conversation. So now you see these different types of closure, but those two particular examples always stand out because they were not the lone examples, right? Some of you all may know Stockton Elementary. Same thing happened, right? So now these spaces now are telling us a different story, right? And now if we think about public housing, and again, this is right around the corner from my house. And when we think about Chicago, one of the most important things is to understand that Chicago at one time had the largest concentration of public housing in the world. There was one complex that was the largest single set of public housing in the world, and that was the Robert Taylor Homes. Now, we always think about Robert Taylor and Stateway being the same set, the same complex. They're right next to each other, but they're actually different. But if we think about the State Street corridor, that's the Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens, then you got IIT in the middle in a very strange way, then you got Dearborn Homes, then you got the Ickeys, and then you have the Hilliard Homes, right? So this stretch of public housing was the largest in the world. So now, in 1999, they figure out, and again, figuring out is giving folks too much credit. They knew that it was in disrepair. And I always appreciate historians because they always challenge me to go to the archives. So the Chicago Housing Authority doesn't have a single set of archives. So you got to go to all these different spaces to find out what happened in public housing. But I was lucky enough to get to the Pritchard Papers at the University of Chicago. And I find the writings of a woman named Elizabeth Wood. And I also find the writings of Robert Taylor. Elizabeth Wood was the president of the Chicago Housing Authority. She told people in 1949 that high-rise public housing would never work because you did not have the money to repair it. Robert Taylor, who was the president of the board of the Chicago Housing Authority, echoed the same commentary. He said the most sustainable public housing is low-rise and tenant-run. Elizabeth Wood was fired. Robert Taylor was dismissed as the chair of the board. He actually battled with depression until his untimely passing. And then, with the audacious ridiculousness and vindictiveness of the Chicago Housing Authority, they named the Robert Taylor Homes after the person who told them that they would never work. Right? So that always, to me, it's always, when I would see the Taylors, I was just like, he told folks. And they knew it. And to the point where Henry Cisneros came to Chicago because the Chicago Housing Authority had been taken over by the federal government. And literally said, what's happening here? So now a group of private developers, along with a couple of federal agencies, get together and they write this thing called the Plan for Transformation. Now, again, not conspiracy, public. At the end of the Plan for Transformation, they say there is not enough money to fund it. So to this day, April 1st, 2026, of the 80% of all high-rise public housing that has been destroyed in the city of Chicago, less than 40% has been replaced. So you literally have a displacement engine. So now the question becomes, where did those people go? And when we start to look at that, and IRRPP has asked this question and found folks in all these different spaces, but I think it's important. When the Robert Taylor homes first came down, one of the first places that people went to was not outside of the city or into the western burbs or outside of the state. The first place that people went was South Shore. And then South Shore, 5 years after that, and this is the work of Aiden Lowry, South Shore led the city in evictions. So now when we think about this in real time, we're putting together this actual set of who gets marked for disposability, because now to live in those new homes, you have to qualify. You have to be lease compliant. You have to work 30 hours a week. No one in the household can have a history of drug abuse. No one in the household can have a felony. Now, for rich people, this does not matter. Right? There's a bunch of rich people in big places downtown, probably doing a boatload of cocaine and heroin, who have never had to worry about qualifications. But poor black people do. And now we have to ask that question. And when we think about that displacement and dispersal, it shifts up our understanding, because now in a hyper-segregated city, those people are dispersed into places where they may not be known. And there's always the assumption, if you are in a place where you are not known, that conflict is more likely to occur. Now, let's deepen this a little bit. I had to use that picture, right? Just because, right? Just the absurdity of it, right? But I had a conversation with one of my old high school basketball teammates, who was actually getting his PhD in sociology. And I was talking to him about the concept of engineered conflict. And he said, look, man, I want you to talk to my old commanding officer. And he used to work on what was referred to as a gang tactical unit. These were the people who were literally designated to address what they referred to as violent suppression. So he said, look, Stovall, I've heard about your work. He said, I absolutely agree. He said, but I want to tell you how to make a killer. I'm like, what? He said, look, it's simple. You don't have a place for them to live. You don't have a place for them to work. You don't have access to health care. You don't have viable education. Then you hire me to contain them with the hope that they will kill each other in the process. Now, this isn't outside of CPD. This is from a former member of CPD who said, look, we know that no black or brown baby born in the city of Chicago or on the planet has a natural propensity to crime. But what we do know is that certain situations will inevitably result in conflict. They know it. So now, if it is known, why is so little done to address it from those issues? And when I talk to some police officers, they often remind me that is not the job of police. And then I always say, well, what is the job of police? And sometimes they answer me very directly. And they said to be beholden to the will of the mayor and powerful property owners. Straightforward with it, right? That is our job. That is who we are responsible to, right? So when we talk about gangs, and I think Chicago always gets this bad rap, and we don't get a clear conversation, right? So what we're really talking about is street organizations. And street organizations in black communities that were actually large federations, right? So when you think about the Almaty Black Pea Stone Nation, that was a conglomerate of 21 organizations. When you think about the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, the full name, that was also a conglomerate of 12 different groupings, right? So your gangster disciples is actually part of a truce between the black gangsters and the supreme gangsters. Larry Hoover, whose name you often hear in hip-hop songs, was part of the supreme gangsters. Donnies David Barksdale was part of the Black Disciples. When they actually linked together for protection of communities. this briefly formed organization called LSD, Lords, Stones, and Disciples, that actually worked here out west to actually build out community structures. So many of you all know the story of the conservative vice lords. They used to own a gas station, an ice cream shop, and check this out, an art gallery. So the lords had an art gallery. And I'm looking in the Red Squad papers, I'm like, damn, look. And I'm seeing Frank Gore and folks, I'm like, damn, they had an art gallery up the street. So now, when we start to think about this, how does it devolve into those spaces? But a bunch of things can be true at the same time. And because a bunch of things can be true in the same time, so there was engagement in the quote-unquote illicit/underground economy. There was engagement in the control of sex work. And there was also this moment of community building. But Larry Hoover actually encapsulated on this, and I'll give you all a quick story about this. Many of you all who are Southsiders may remember a place called the Regal Theater. Now, 79th Street was not the original place where the Regal Theater was, right? The Regal Theater used to be on 43rd. 47th, thank you. So when the Regal Theater was in this is late 80s, early 90s, I remember listening to the radio, and on the radio they used to announce parties, right? So you'd just be like, and you would always get geeked if one of your homies got named. He was like, oh, I heard you, yo, the party, I'm coming through, right? So one time I'm driving, I hit 79th and Stony, and I hear that there's a party being sponsored by Growth and Development. Right? And I said, damn, folks got parties now? Right? That was my initial response. Like, damn, folks party. Damn, folks legit, right? So there actually was an organization called 21st Century Vote. The subsidiary of 21st Century Vote was Growth and Development. Right? You see how they flipped the initials. But what had also happened, at the same time, the federal government had success with RICO cases. And RICO just means for Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, right? So this actually worked well with the mafia. So the idea of RICO is if one person is engaged with behavior, you can charge everyone in the organization with the same crime, right? So they thought the same thing would work with Gangster Disciples. The exact opposite happened. And they called this thing Operation Headache. It was an indictment of 38 members of the leadership of the Gangster Disciple Nation. When all those leaders got rounded up, when they became incarcerated, something else was happening. Schools were being closed, public housing was being destroyed, and people were being dispersed into neighborhoods where they were unfamiliar. Hence, conflict. So when we talk about spikes in crime or spikes in homicides, we notice that there's very little conversation about structural violence. There's very little conversation about displacement. We individualize it to one person, but we're not talking about the collective of experiences that people have to now engage each other violently, right? And now when we think about Operation Headache, what we started to see that in certain neighborhoods, there were no longer affiliations to the large sets. But now you have folks calling themselves 300, 600, Suwu, Dro City, right? And even many of you all familiar with the MC Lil Durk, who caught a terrible case. But him and his folks from 300 and 600 and No Limit, they had a song called We're Not From 63rd, right? And they're literally from like 67th. Right, but just that division became so central, right? So when King Von was killed, right, 300 and 600 now engaged a beef with folks who were black disciples who lived in a place that is really called Parkway Gardens, but many of us know it as O Block, right? And the story of O Block is actually a young brother named Odeem was killed, and the O is for Odeem, right? So now when we put that into context, we got to ask a different question. Right? It's like, maybe it's the NSA. So now we got to ask a different question. If we know this to be true, what are people doing to change conditions? And this is a picture from a space right up the street on the corner of Lexington and Homan. It was called Freedom Square. Now, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but as a young person on the South Side, there was this urban legend that you never wanted to get caught up out west because they would take you to this space and beat you up and then kick you out of it. So that was just in our minds, right? But that was a real place. Homan Square was a black ops site that the Chicago Police Department used for torture, right? So now and the story gets leaked by these two white dudes who were taken there by mistake, right? So they go to a WTO protest downtown, and for some reason, the squad car they were in ends up taking them to Homan Square. They're there for about a day and a half, and then they get let out. And they call the London Guardian, which is a newspaper, and they said, we don't know what just happened to us. We were in a space, we were never processed, we were never booked. And there were a bunch of black and brown people in that building, and we don't know what was happening to them. And they let us go. No paperwork, no processing. They opened a side door and kicked us out. And this story actually premiered in 2015. So what these two white dudes did is confirm that this was always happening, right? So that urban legend that I thought as a Southsider was actually true. So now an organization called Let Us Breathe said, all right, well, look, what would it mean to be in this space, to bring public attention to it, and then also to ask different questions of our reality? Now, something else happens. Many of you all remember the protests in Ferguson, Missouri after the police killing of Michael Brown. Some of you all may remember a tweet from a group of Palestinian youth, two black people in Ferguson. They say literally, you are about to be tear gassed. Here are some things that you can do. You need to get gas masks. So this group of young folks here in Chicago read this tweet, and they take gas masks to Ferguson. When they take those gas masks to Ferguson, the thing they say is, well, what do we need to be doing in our own locale? And then about 6-7 months later, I was in a performance venue called the Promontory, which ironically is now closed. And in the back of the Promontory, it was a group of young folks, and they had all these clothes in the back, and they had like all these hangers and like stands. And I just asked the young brother, I was like, he was a tall brother, and I was like, yeah, man, who are y'all? What do y'all do? He was like, yeah, brother, this is a free store. Take what you need. But just take what you need. Right? And I always remember that. He was like, yeah, man, we got a space. We want to make sure that folks have what they need. And that moved into understanding housing. It moved into understanding food delivery and actual food cultivation. So they developed a community garden, and they started to feed people, and they started to have community dinners. And then another organization called Equity and Transformation said, well, look, if we know that the welfare state is problematic, what could we learn if we thought about guaranteed income? So many of you all may have heard of what's called the Stanford-Stockton Guaranteed Income Experiment. And what happens was 500 families were given $1,000 a month for 12 months. They study this, and what economists find out blows them away. The first thing that families do when they had that $1,000 a month for 12 months, the first thing they do to the 92nd percentile was pay bills. The second thing they do, which really freaked economists out, was that 95% of them went out and looked for work. So now, and these were all black and brown families. So now the question becomes, well, we actually know what works, but to what extent will we do it? And Equity and Transformation is actually running a guaranteed income program here in Chicago, right? And we're seeing very similar results. The last organization, and I think this really becomes important because it gives us a sense of what to do and the necessity of fugitivity, right? Because I always tease my homies in academia, everybody has, every terminology, every theoretical construct has their sexy moment, right? So CRT had its sexy moment, right? Black radical feminism had its sexy moment, right? And right now we're in the sexy moment of abolition. But the question becomes, do people understand what it is and what it means? Because if we determine something to be unacceptable, we have to be willing to replace those things that are unacceptable and that are harming us. And Ujima medics have stepped out on this, right? So the question they've been asking of community is, what do you do when the ambulance doesn't come? And that's a different question, right? That's a real fugitive question that many of us have had family members and seen people in certain ways deal with this. Now, when the ambulance doesn't come, this group of nurses and community organizers say to themselves, well, we need to train folks on how to treat gunshot wounds. So they literally were doing workshops in people's homes, showing them how to stabilize people who have been shot and how to get them to care. And now what that morphed into was now they had to talk about, well, what else are we dealing with? Respiratory issues, heart issues, diabetes. So now they took that initiative to say, when the ambulance doesn't come, now we can begin to do that work and other work. So this future is possible, but the question that we need to be asking is, how do we limit our relationship with the state? I went there, y'all, because a lot of times people think about this as something that will get you further in trouble. I'm on hella list, and it is just what it is, right? And if we are not clear that we are in a fight, something is wrong. So now, because we understand that there is a fight, these three organizations have said, we're not afraid. And because we're not afraid, here's the work we're willing to do. And this is the thing that I try to capture in the book, you know, to the best of my ability, right? Because when you turn in a book, sometimes it's just like, okay, here's this thing. I don't know, but here's this thing. But that thing, the hope is that I have articulated this to the extent that people can understand it. Every book is always incomplete. But in that incompletion, hopefully it allows us to recognize what's possible and, more importantly, what people are actively doing. But thank y'all again, and we'll get into a conversation about possibility.
One more time in your loud voice for Dave Stovall. I just want to start by saying how honored I am to be up here with you, Dave. For so many of us, particularly at UIC, but in this city, you are our OG, Dave. And we've watched you and we've learned from you for so long. And so I am so excited about this book. It was a pleasure to read. I learned a lot. And I'm excited for this conversation. As was mentioned earlier, there are note cards coming around. If you have questions, comments, put it on the note cards. We're going to get to them. You know, one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this book and being in this hall were some questions that former CTU President Karen Lewis would ask. And these came from something she drew on from the civil rights scholar Lonnie Guinier. And she would ask, who are the winners and who are the losers? Who makes the rules to the game? And what are the stories that the winners tell the losers to keep them playing the game? And I feel like in this book, Dave, and with this idea of engineered conflict, you've unpacked that for us. You've answered those questions about so many dynamics that we've been experiencing as a city for a long time. But I want to start actually by talking about how you came to this project. You mentioned that you've been working on this for 25 years. It is a mix of deep research, personal reflections, family stories. Why was it important for you to write this? And I also want to know, maybe you can tell us something about your writing process. If you haven't read this yet, David Stovall gives a good 2 pages in the acknowledgments to just name-dropping coffee shops. Like, he is single-handedly keeping cafes in business. So can you say a bit about, why this project was so important for you, and about the process of writing it?
Yeah, so, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the question, because the process for me was always, and I feel, and this is a Chicago thing, right? I feel like when people try to tell Chicago stories, they always mess it up, right? So like, if it's the shy, no shade, but shade, man, quit playing, right? And when I see that, I'm like, who is this, right? What Chicago person in the Bear is calling River North a gritty area? What the fuck, what are we doing? Right, so for me, I'm like, look, y'all, it's that time to tell a Chicago story and to do it in positioning myself in relationship to history, in relationship to sociology, in relationship to the function of the city, right? So what does it mean to grow up in a city rooted on patronage and the Chicago machine? What does it mean to grow up in a hyper-segregated city? What does it mean to grow up with many of the members of those street organizations that I talk about were my homies who I played basketball, football, and ran track with, right? So to humanize that story, but not to go into something that just becomes the trauma porn, right? Because you can talk about homicides in a very dehumanizing way. But I wanted to say there's something happening here. And now here's how we articulate some of those things that are happening. And then in terms of the process, I have a very general rule. I do not write at home. So in addition to being an office rat, I also start going to all these cafes, right? And it's a bad situation when you start knowing the staff. Right. Or when they say, where you been? It's been a minute. Right? Like literally happened today. They was like, look when they say, I ain't seen you in a minute, right? But that type of thing. And then back to that process, and it became one where there was a search for cafes that stayed open past 6 o'clock. Right? Because in Chicago, many of us who may remember older days, those cafes that were 24 hours, right? So when folks start closing, like sometimes you got these cafes that open at 6 in the morning, close at like 6:30 a.m., right? It's like 6 to 6:30, right? If you don't get it, too bad, right? So it became a search for those places, but also really being immersed. That was a place to kind of put together the thoughts, because a lot of these chapters, I'm trying to talk about 3 things at the same time. So it's really around developing what that conversation is. And now saying that conversation around, here's the connection. So we're not talking about one thing singularly, but we're talking about what it's connected to. So that's the story of me as a Chicagoan in terms of the history, but then also being able to put that together as part of a process. And I'm not gonna lie to you, it got funky in terms of like trying to do that some days. So some days you just kind of come home and you're just like, what just happened, right? And then you kind of go back and figure out, here's the broader conversation.
No, thank you for that. And that's great, because it actually segues very nicely to my next question. And I just want to say also, like, Dave has bars in this book. You were talking about, again, this idea of engineered conflict and bringing together education, housing, and violence together in conversation. And one of the things you said about education, you said neoliberalism played on the desperation of families who have been denied access to quality education. And it made me think a lot, and your conversation about Woodlawn in particular resonated very strongly with me. I was teaching in Woodlawn during the years that you were talking about, from 2006 to 2010, and having charter schools co-located with neighborhood schools, having these schools moving around, opening schools, closing schools. I remember the tension of students traversing the drama that was happening between O Block and Dro City. I remember, like these moments. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, there are folks who study housing, there are folks who study education, there are folks who study violence. What do you think putting those things in conversation with each other at that intersection shows us and demonstrates that's missed when you're looking at them in a silo?
I think I always think about a conversation with a Chicago public school teacher by the name of John Yolich. Uplift, Community Academy, and Social Justice High School actually were developed in the exact same year. So we used to actually sit down with each other and exchange ideas about curriculum. And John Yolich would always say this. He said, anytime you have a problem with a young person, remember, it is never the young person. It is what they are dealing with and what they are connected to. So for me, it was always, well, here's what folks are dealing with. Here's what they are connected to. So it's never a singular story. It is never the bad young person, right? It's often the young person that is navigating structural violence. It's the young person who is navigating this ability to survive in a world that says they are disposable first, right? And then to even say, what does it mean to live in a world that thinks you to be criminal before you are human, right? And I think that's and I often think about this current moment, right? Because that's what I see in terms of this kind of this lockdown on teen takeovers. That's what that is, right? They don't see those young people as having the capacity to do something else, but they have become criminalized just by gathering, right? So I think it's really important to think about, we are never talking about a singular story, and now how do those layers play out in real time?
Thank you, and I appreciate the language that you give us to talk about this, understanding this not as interpersonal violence, but structural violence that crosses these different sectors. I also appreciate it, and you got to this at the end of your presentation, the way you also lifted up people who are actively thinking about otherwise ways of being and doing things, of freedom dreaming, of thinking about policy solutions, of working to meet communities' needs and community members' needs on the day-to-day. You mentioned talking about the Let Us Breathe Collective, UMedics, Equity and Transformation. And you also talk in the book about Miriam Kaba and Kelly Hayes and this question they tell us to ask about abolition. 2 questions, quote, what should we do and what should we create? So 2 questions I have for you. 1, Dave, what should we do and what should we create? That's for you. But also, can you say more also about why it was important for you? Because this part of the book, the format changes. Instead of Dave writing, sort of expository writing for us, he switches and really elevates the voices of those who are on the ground doing that work in their first-person narrative. Why was it important to include that in that way? And what should, in your perspective, we be doing?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I'll talk about that shift first, because I think the main thing was to say, well, we often think about, and for many folks who might be in grad school or perhaps what have you, they do this thing, they call them semi-structured interviews, right? Or the focus group. And I wanted to kind of break that up a bit and say, well, let's have people talk about what they do, right? And let's have them talk about what they do in a way that highlights their work, right? And that's actually an older kind of magazine format that they call the Q&A, right? So I just thought, I thought about, well, what does it mean to kind of use that kind of format to say, well, and then the other part of it was, I didn't want the book to be, well, here's all this gloom and doom, deal with it. But to say, no, there are people who are actually working to address this, right? There are people who are actively doing things in their community that are working to change conditions. And then to the two questions, and I think about those two questions as the two questions of abolition, right? And the first answer, right, what should we do? Something, right? Because I think this is the thing. Because I think this is the thing, right? In the current moment, we are conditioned to just hold ourselves in, right? To be either anesthetized or paralyzed by the heft of the moment, right? So now that thing is to say, well, what is it that people need? How are we addressing or contributing to what people need? How do we grow it, right? And now this thing around what are we building, right? We're building ways for people to work tangibly, materially, with each other to lessen reliance on the state and think about ourselves as the sources of our liberation, right? So this thing around really being, and not to say that as a flighty statement, right? But to say that is a material statement. That is something that we can touch. That is something that we engage, right? That's something that people are actively doing. I think about, I've been hearing about this, and a couple folks that I've been working with actually do this with their young people. Many of you all have heard about the walking bus, right? Which is an ICE strategy, right? A strategy to repel ICE. And this thing literally comes about from people saying, well, what can we do, right? And now if we want to keep young folks safe, here's what we can do, right? I think about a guy whose name I think we don't say enough, who's the principal at Juarez, a guy named Juan Carlos Ocon, right? Who says, look, all right, I got 50 organizations that meet at my schoolhouse monthly. Let's pool our money together, buy some vans, and take young folks back and forth from the schoolhouse to the house because we know what's happening to them, right? This is the principal who buys an industrial washing machine in her schoolhouse because she knows that her families may not have access to a washer and dryer, right? This is the schoolhouse that has a tax accountant come to the schoolhouse and do prepare taxes pro bono, right? It's the stuff, and the other thing, it's the stuff that we know that we have always done in Black life when dealing with oppression. And I'll end with this story. I had an aunt who raised me and my mother. And my mom is the 9th of 9 and the only girl, right? So my pops was going through it, right? But this thing around, she would have me, when I first started to drive, she saw me as the transportation system, right? So I'm 16, I learned how to drive, and she has me deliver pastries all up and down King Drive. Now, I don't get any money for this, right? In terms of, to me, to give to my aunt. I get like a hammer. I get like a cheese grater. I'm like, damn, like, so they had figured out a system when they came to Chicago to support each other that did not use money, right? So this thing around really being in tune to that, because, and I had, as a 16-year-old, I had no knowledge of mutual aid, but that's what they were doing, right? And those bartering systems, historians now have recorded, right? So this thing around really putting that into context around that possibility, right? And then how do we keep each other? And I guess the other thing, an example, when it gets hot in Chicago, you all see the city of Chicago has what these things called cooling centers. They got that idea from elders in La Villita. Because during the 95 heat wave, all these Latine families got in churches, opened the doors, and brought fans. When you look at the death rate between La Villita and North Lawndale, which are right next to each other, less than 3% of the population of La Villita had any, not just dying, but had any heat-related illnesses. right? Where in North Lawndale, where people were isolated from folks, you had the largest concentrations of death, right? So I think about really putting that into context so people know what to do, but it's to what extent will we engage it?
Thank you. I'm going to start putting some questions here together that folks have been sending up. So you were talking about mutual aid. You also talked about sort of strategies of self-determination, and you talked about the state. So there's a question related to that. Can you expand on the idea of the state? Can the state ever serve a liberatory purpose, in your opinion, for example, with our current mayoral administration or other examples?
Right. I think the state is always contested, meaning that there will be breakages in it where you can access resources. There will also be spaces where it will lay a heavy hand on you, right? So if many of us remember Bruce Rauner, and remember the state of Illinois did not have a budget for 2 years, right? And what that actually did, right? Or somebody like a Pritzker who has his problems, but low key, Pritzker gets Illinois' budget from a F minus, which I did not know existed, to an A. But here's the thing, he paid the majority of the bills, right? So this thing around really, so now if you're dealing with something that is that precarious, now we have to think about how do we support ourselves, because that thing from the state may or may not come. And if you are a person of color and poor in this city or this state, there is no guarantee that you will be supported in the way that you need, right? It's like my father always says this about the Trump administration. He says, young blood, what evidence have they given you that they would ever do right by you, right? And now, can you fool yourself into believing that those folks will ever do right by you and they have never shown you something to the affirmative, right? So when I see organizations like Chicago Flips Red, I'm saying to myself, y'all, what we doing, right? What evidence has been presented to you, right? Or how are you fooling yourself to think that you could get next to power and now benefit from you just being next to it, right? So I think that when we talk about the state, it's really understanding those systems where you are supposed to be afforded, have certain affordances, but that's deeply contested, right? And it's often taken away from you before it is distributed to you.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple here. And I know you talk about this in the book. Can you talk about your thoughts on whether or how Go CPS is engineering conflict, and more generally, the role of charter schools, privatization in engineering conflict in the education space?
Very quickly about Go CPS, and I actually, thank you for that question, because I actually have a section about that. Go CPS actually becomes, for people who are familiar with Go CPS is what families look at when they are deciding a school to send their young person to. Now, in Go CPS, you have a selection, I believe, of 15 schools. And I just thought about it. I'm not a mathematician, but I was talking to mathematicians about this, and just kind of think about it very practically. If you have 15 schools, what happens to those schools that are constantly in the bottom 5 in terms of choices? Those schools are instantly depopulated, right? So now when we think about that in real time, you have a mechanism by which to depopulate schools, right? And this is often connected to the neoliberal rhetoric of, well, parents need choice, and if you don't make the choice, it is your fault. Many of us remember Katrina 20 years ago, and the blame that was placed on families who did not leave was that it was their fault, right? When we haven't paid attention to the structural inequity that now prevents people from leaving because they may not have access to transportation, right? So I think that Go CPS really becomes very nefarious in terms of how it functions, right? Because now it becomes straight math. I mean, it's arithmetic, right? If you got schools in that bottom 5 and they keep showing up, they're not going to have students, right? So I think it's really important to put that, and under neoliberal urbanism, right, this idea that the market, not even the state, but the market is the best arbiter of people's needs. Now they say, well, this thing doesn't need to exist because we're spending too much money to keep it open, right? So I think this really becomes important, and this is gonna, and you and I have talked about this on numerous occasions, this is what's going to come down the pipeline in the next 2 years when we talk about deeply underpopulated schools and whether or not they will stay open, right? Because it's not about the school closing as much as it is young people having access to the resources they need if the school has been severely depopulated. And I think that's a very important piece to put to families in terms of not thinking about the closing, but thinking about the resources, because the lack of resources will facilitate the closing.
Now look, I'm trying to get through 3 more.
Oh, wait, for sure.
And we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I need you to lighten around me.
All right.
And these are not low-key questions.
Right.
Okay, number 1. How can we recover from all the harm that's been done by school closings and these other forms of dispossession, spiritually and materially?
Right. Very quickly, we have to commit to being together. I take this from a good friend, Ananka Shoni. She always says, the plan emerges when we commit to be together. Right, and I think that I think is the basis of all organizing, right? You have found an issue. You have figured out that something is not going right. Now you put your thoughts together and say, what is possible?
Come on, Dave, succinct and deep. Okay, for liberation educators and radical folks who are working in the system, how can we begin to center school system? How can we begin to center housing and violence in our professional learning and actions and work?
I think one of the most important things is to always have an understanding of context. Nothing you talk about in your classroom happens in a vacuum. It is always connected to something. So now what are those things they are connected to? How are they connected through our community? How are they connected through our day-to-day? What things have people actually engaged to bring attention to it? So there's always something happening, and there's always something that you can connect to it. Now, real talk, that's extra work. But good teachers always do extra work, right? And I think it's really important to think about that. And now, for those of us who may not be in classrooms, we have to figure out how to support that. Right? Because in too many instances, people don't talk about, it's real tough right now to teach. You got to say that, right? So now what does it mean to support folks understanding that reality?
You're doing great. I'm gonna sneak 2 more in.
Right.
Okay. Since you've completed this book, and you always say, and you said this, and I really appreciate this, and this is something Cedric Johnson told me. He was like, whatever version of the book you put in, that's the last version. It's is there ever a final? It's the last draft. It might not be the final draft, it's the last draft. What are things that, you feel like are missing, or opportunities to talk about? Like, what are the things that you're like, oh, I really wish I could have got to this, or I can't wait for someone else to go in this direction?
Yeah, I really want somebody to go into that law enforcement piece a little more, because there's some antecedents in there where there's a genesis story there, right? I just have kind of the ways in which these particular policies came out, but there's a genesis story, and there's a guy named Simon Balto who wrote a piece called Occupied Territory. And he breaks this thing out that the Chicago Police Department in the late 60s had an operating chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in it, right? Now, many people are like, no shit, but I think putting that in deepening that to an origin story, because there's something that comes out of that, because the question I'm always saying is that somebody allowed that, right? So that was the thing about John Burge, right? Those tortures, somebody allowed that, right? That was not something that was stopped immediately upon hearing about it. So I would hope that somebody kind of gets to those origin stories, and I think that might be where the oral history kind of comes in, yeah.
So I want to end on this one, particularly being in this house today, and this is one I had on my list too, so we double dipping. Today is the 10th anniversary of the one-day strike that CTU, higher ed, Black-led organizations, clap it up. This was April 1st, 2016. I know I remember being there. I know you remember being there. And that was around funding our futures. That was around supporting people's whole lives. And going back to what you were talking about earlier, was in the context of Bruce Rauner denying funding in many of the same ways we see Doge-like activity happening at the federal level, but happening here for our state. What are the lessons from April 1st, 2016 that you think we can take for April 1st, 2026?
I think one is to think about May 1st, 2026, where you shut it down, right? And you put the message to people that this is unacceptable. But I go back to, and something that Karen Lewis and the organizers that they sat with when CORE was in early formation to say, look, there has to be a determination around what we will do. And this is the thing. We have to be willing to trust folks, because now the thing that we are held accountable to is the work, right? And I think that's a very different thing, because it's not just trusting you because Stovall wrote this thing, right? But what is the work that I'm actually doing with folks, right? And who actually can say that work is worthwhile, right? I think this is the moment to recognize and realize the power of organizing, but not just for the purpose of organizing, but organizing, understanding that collective visions allow us to support those who have been pushed to the margins, because now we got an opportunity to put those concerns in the center. In many cases, when we do not put the issues and concerns of the marginalized in our analysis, we further marginalize them. And I think this is the opportunity to shift that, bring it back, because I think that's how we address schools, that's how we address housing, that's how we address law enforcement. What are those issues and concerns of the folks who have been marginalized, and how do we bring it right back into our understanding in the center?
Well, I look forward to do some collective visioning with you, sir. Another big round of applause for Dave Stovall.
Thank you all.
He will be signing books, so please get his book, read his book, and this has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Big thank you to David and Elizabeth very much for joining us today. Again, big thank you to our partners for this event, the CTU Foundation and Haymarket Books, and of course, thank you all for being here. If you'd like to support future programs and the work of IRRPP, we also have a table in the back where some of our staff, thank you very much, are working. You can get a cool t-shirt and that sort of thing. And please pick up a report, buy David's book, and Elizabeth's book, which I don't have anymore up here, but you can imagine it. Anyway, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Have a great day.